Hey, welcome back to the Ready State. One of the things that we are privy to is a lot of people trying to solve a lot of complex problems in high-performance environments. One of the things that we try to help the people we work with do is simplify their program. What are the key elements and how do we make sense of how those elements interact? Now, if you recall back around the turn of the millennia, you remember that we had the Y2K bug, and everyone was kind of freaked out about that because we weren't sure if the computers were all going to crash. And that was particularly because of a concept called the Kluge. Now, if you work in modern technology, you are familiar with this. So let's say you have a little website, and then you have a plug-in to that, and then you solve in with another piece of software. And ultimately, you have this really inelegant, chunky system that isn't fast, isn't efficient, isn't effective. And when you decide that you want to change some aspect of it, you realize you can't because the whole system is so unwieldy and it's hard to see inputs and outputs. And so what you have to do is start again. You have to wipe fresh. And this is known as the Kluge concept. Now, one of the things that we're always trying to do then is as we apply this thinking is understanding that when we walk into programs, we see a lot of kind of discussions about methodology from we're powerlifting, Oli lifting, collegiate strength and conditioning, gymnastics, GPP, recovery psychology tradition. All of these things integrate into what we call the suicide soda. And you remember that the suicide soda was that you would take a cup and then hit all of the delicious drink mixtures and root beer and lemonade and Diet Mountain Dew all mixed together to make something terrible. And we ended up with the suicide. And it's really difficult for us to make sense for our athletes' understanding. And what it feels like is that we have a lot of complexity that isn't making our lives easier, isn't easy to understand, isn't easy to diagnose. And remember, we're always trying to make sure that our programming is predictive, explanatory, and repeatable. Like those are the heart and soul of what it is we're trying to do. On top of the fact that we're always working with complicated humans. And that leads us to a wonderful book we discovered by a guy named Matthew Frederick called 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School. And one of the ideas in this book is this idea of what we call informed simplicity. And let me explain that to you. Because as a new coach, you walk into a world and you're like, this is awesome. The world is so simple. You start to see that there are just a few simple things, nutrition, Olympic lifting, performance, boom, done. Right? Mix, wash, repeat, and then clearly, in a second, most of us walk into something that we understand is complexity. That there are lots of tools that I'm trying to make sense of, and as I go off and learn a new skill set, I come back in and you're like, oh, this week is clubs. This month is kettlebells. I just went to an Olympic lifting conjugate program, and that's what we're doing. And so what we tend to see is that people end up kind of moving through fads, and they don't see the through narrative for all the programming that they're doing. It's difficult to understand what we're trying to change, what are the things that we're trying to measure, how do we come to understand what's working and what's not working, and more importantly, what's the expression of that in the field. And as we move beyond that, here we have an idea of what we call informed simplicity. And so it's complexity created through a notion that in here I have 3 objects, here I have 12 objects creating all of these different variables, and ultimately I need to only have 3 objects that interact in such a way where I can see inputs and outputs. And this is really our hallmark of what we're thinking is modern strength and conditioning, modern performance training. This is the head of the snake. What we're trying to do here is make sure that we, at the head of performance, are understanding sleep, and we're understanding breathing, and we're understanding movement minimums, and strength and conditioning, and positional competency, right? Stress, psycho-emotional behaviors. Do I belong to the tribe? We've got to work more at simplifying our systems so we can understand the inputs that we know have input, that we know have effect, and we can start to get rid of some of the complexity which makes our athletes confused, which confuses coaches, and more importantly, doesn't lead us to the goal, which is ultimately about simplifying, streamlining, so that we can get our athletes out of the gym and onto the field. So as you're thinking about this and your own program, what are those big blocks? How are you measuring them? How do they interrelate? When do my athletes eat? Is it close to the squat rack? Where does performance physio belong? Is it in the gym, or is it a separate unit where my athletes don't have any interaction between how they're eating, how they're warming up, and the rehab that they're doing on? So as we're working through this, we're always going to say, fight the Kluge, do all your best to understand that we like to chase shiny things. It's easy to end up with this gigantic, unwieldy system, and it's hard to understand inputs and outputs. But guess what? You got this.